Hello, everybody. It's Maurice Button here, the CEO of City Financial Global, and welcome to the latest in our series of speaker interviews. I'm very pleased to have with us today Rachael Annear, who's a partner at Freshfields. Rachel's going to be speaking at our AI Regulation Summit, which is being held in London on the 5th of October. Rachael, welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to be here this afternoon.
Very nice to have you with us. Let's turn to our first question. How does the UK pro-innovation approach to the regulation of AI differ from what we are seeing in other jurisdictions?
So I suppose I should start really by kind of briefly framing what we mean by the UK's pro-innovation approach, because
Yeah,
I think sometimes some concepts get a bit conflated. And I think there's no doubt that kind of innovation and growth is really at the heart of what the UK is trying to achieve in its AI strategy. But I think really what we're talking about when we're comparing the UK approach to, say, other jurisdictions is the fact that the UK hasn't proposed any specific legislation to
yeah,
deal with AI. Instead, it's planning to introduce a set of cross-sectoral principles and sort of use these as guiding lights for the existing regulators. So this kind of most often gets compared to the approach in the EU, where, as many people will know, they have introduced specific or are planning to introduce specific horizontal legislation in the form of the AI Act. And this is another similar approach that's being taken in Canada as well.
yeah.
In China, kind of by contrast, although we're seeing legislation, it's more targeted. So they have the algorithmic recommendation regulation and more recently a generative AI regulation. For me, it seems harder to articulate the strategy in the US, and there'll be many who know it better than I do. But from my observations, whilst we're hearing quite a lot about sort of legislative proposals and kind of principles at a federal level, really what we're seeing is kind of a combination of interpreting existing and then new kind of data privacy laws which are coming through, and also the use of existing federal agency powers. And
Mm.
I think so we're sort of seeing these different approaches in kind of implementation, so whether legislative or through existing powers and regulators. But I think it's important to note that while we're seeing those differences in implementation, there are quite a lot of commonalities we're seeing in the underlying principles. And I think a lot of those can be traced back to things like the OECD AI principles. So, for
Mm.
example, the principles of transparency and explainability and accountability. Those will be familiar across kind of multiple regimes. And certainly the UK recognises the need to remain interoperable globally in this space.
Yeah, so well, very, very interesting. And in the UK, as you say, it's going to be working on a principal basis, but through an existing group of regulators, notably the CMC, the ICO, the FCA, Ofcom, and the MHPRA. It's a potential problem with that there's going to be overlap between them and perhaps slightly different viewpoint on how you apply those principles in their particular sector.
Yes, and I'd say almost certainly there's going to be overlap. It's the very nature of AI, but actually the UK's
Mm.
approach does recognise that overlap and therefore the need for this close regulatory coordination. And in
Mm.
fact, the CMA, the ICO, and Ofcom back in 2020 kind of recognised this need for closer coordination between the regulators who were advising on digital matters. And of course, now AI falls firmly within the space of digital cooperation. And even, although we're only at the stage of the white paper for the UK government, we're already seeing some of those closer coordination steps take place in the context of AI. So, for example, those regulators plus the FCA, who is now a member of the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum, are looking together at the concept of fairness, which is one of the core principles for AI, and those who kind of work in those spaces recognize that principle across those different regimes. And also the DRCF is, I think we just heard this week that they're piloting the new multi-regulator advisory service, which is being dubbed the AI and Digital Hub. And that's part of what was kind of flagged as the AI framework by the UK. So there seems to be a lot of activity going on to kind of counteract that danger of overlap, and it's almost an advantage because it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be plain sailing, but because AI by its nature is not going to sit in a silo, it's going to sit
Absolutely.
across different sectors, and therefore leveraging the kind of the deep sectoral expertise of each of these regulators and bringing them together to coordinate, you know, sounds like a very pragmatic way to do it. It's not, again, not going to be without problem, but you can see why that approach, has been kind of put forward.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there's general or the potential for general agreement about sort of core principles across jurisdictions. Do you think that that will go some way towards sort of harmonizing AI regulation globally? Or do you think there's always going to be the danger of a sort of regulatory arbitrage in how AI companies might view it?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've had quite a lot about sort of establishment of global principles. Of course, the OECD principles are now quite a few years old, but more recently with the G20 activities and UNESCO, there's sort of this concept that bringing people together globally is really, really going to make a difference. But I think, even with broad agreement at the principle level, there's still a very real risk of fragmentation in how it's implemented. And when I spoke just earlier about so the different approaches that are being taken, the differences are really between, legislation, broad brush for legislation, principles level. And so even, for example, if we have an agreement that AI should be explainable, that's one of the kind of core concepts that we often hear. This kind of
Mm,
thing, it's difficult to know how that would even translate into a kind of a global specific obligation when even computer scientists would struggle with that concept because of the very nature of how AI works. And
mm,
then you layer onto that kind of the different political and social perspectives in each jurisdiction, you start to see how it'd be very easy that even if you've got this global agreement at a principal level, for jurisdictions to start to diverge in what that means kind of on a local level at implementation. And I think
mm.
another thing to be very aware of is that different jurisdictions have different priorities and different kind of countries at different stages of development. So post Brexit, the UK very much focusing on growth and establishing itself as a centre for AI, which really then is reflected in trying to have a non-legislative, light touch approach to
Yeah,
regulation,
yeah.
which is, its motivators are different from the EU, which has to bring together, a coherence across a large number of different countries.
Do you think, yeah, I agree, everybody has a different starting point and a different context that they're working towards, and hence the difference between the UK and the EU's approach in particular. But do you think in due course that there'll be a sort of a dominant model for AI regulation, perhaps because of the fact that so many of these AI companies are based in the US, or have the roots in the US? Do you think that a US model might come to dominate the regulation of AI globally, whatever that model might ultimately be? Do you think that might come to dominate?
I think it's a really interesting question because I think the more common question we are getting at the moment is whether the UK will be forced to move towards an EU model and actually
Mm,
implement legislation. And there's certainly some who are calling in the UK for that to be the approach that's taken. And it'll be interesting to see after November and the AI Safety Summit whether we're going to see some movement on that basis. And although the US is clearly important as part of the kind of UK economic strategy around AI, we've kind of
mm,
seen from data privacy in terms of actually the legislative framework and the regulatory framework, the EU and its legislation has really led kind of the global kind of implementation of specific legislation around that from the GDPR. And although we've seen sort of individual issues such as like the transfer, international data transfers and things with the US, it's not really been kind of a mapping whole scale either way. And to the actual legislative framework, it's different. I think where we will see influence and what will be interesting will be where the AI has been developed in the US or other countries outside of the UK or the EU with slightly stricter regulatory regimes, then but that AI then is then implemented and used within those stricter regulatory spheres. How will the UK respond
Yeah,
to that kind of thing? Because we, again, in the data privacy space, we've seen the ICO face challenges with on a jurisdictional basis with Clearview AI, because although they have been using data that's originated in the UK, their activities don't clearly fall within the jurisdictional scope of the UK GDPR. And so there's having to be a lot of thought about how those are interpreted and challenges to make sure that that continues. So on a kind of practical level, that extraterritorial impact and the way in which you exercise existing legislation is going to, I think, play out more so than, say, the legislative or regulatory structure.
very interesting. But sadly, Rachel, we have run out of time, but I know that we'll be discussing all of these and many other related issues in greater depth at the AI Regulation Summit on the 5th of October. We very much hope that our viewers of this interview will be able to join us in person at the summit. So I look forward to seeing you there, and thank you very much for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you. I look forward to it.